Welcome back to another Beep Dive. We're really thrilled to have you with us today because we are zeroing in on a highly specific, custom-tailored slice of World War II history.
Yeah, it's a fascinating one.
It really is. We're looking at a German army formation called the Lötzen Infantry Brigade, and our main source for this is a fairly dense Wikipedia article detailing the brigade's incredibly brief existence.
Right, and the sheer administrative velocity required to spin up a formation like this, only to dissolve it months later, it really reframes how we think about the rigidity of historical military structures.
Absolutely. The mission for our deep dive today is to explore how and why this hyperspecific unit was formed, who exactly was drafted into it, and why it vanished from the order of battle almost as quickly as it appeared.
It's a micro-history, really, but it tells a much larger story about Wehrmacht structure and rapid military mobilization.
Definitely. And before we get into the weeds, I do want to add a quick note for you listening. As we dive into these specific World War II unit structures and Wikipedia records today, we're looking at them strictly as historical blueprints.
Right, just the raw facts.
Exactly. We're here to unpack the mechanics of how these formations were documented, taking no sides, just exploring the military history exactly as it's written in the source material.
And there's a lot to unpack there.
For sure. Okay, let's unpack this starting with the timeline, because the lifespan of this brigade is just a blink of an eye in the grand scheme of the war.
The timeline is arguably the most critical piece of context we have. According to the text, the Lötzen Infantry Brigade was officially created on August 16, 1939.
August 16th, 1939. I mean, for anyone studying World War II history, that date carries massive weight.
Oh, absolutely.
The invasion of Poland, the campaign that's documented as Case White that kicked off in September 1939. So they're manifesting this brigade out of thin air just 2 weeks before launching one of the largest motorized invasions the world had ever seen.
Right. And the text notes they formed the brigade in the eastern part of East Prussia. That geographical placement is key.
Because they're right on the border.
Exactly. They were positioned right on the immediate staging ground for the invasion. But what's really striking is their deactivation date. By November 1939, the brigade is completely gone.
Gone.
It existed as an independent entity for roughly 90 days.
Which naturally leads to the overarching why. I mean, why go through the immense logistical headache of drafting the paperwork, requisitioning the gear, organizing the leadership, and deploying thousands of men just to scrub the entire thing 3 months later?
The source text gives us a very clear strategic purpose for that. The Lötzen Infantry Brigade was created specifically to provide flank protection for the Third Army during its initial drive into Poland.
Flank protection?
Yes. What's fascinating here is the absolute necessity of dedicated flank protection in a massive motorized offensive.
Protecting the Third Army's flank during Case White was it was a massive logistical vulnerability. You can't just push a vanguard that heavy into hostile territory without a dedicated shield moving parallel to absorb potential counteroffensive.
Right, because if a vanguard's momentum is entirely forward-facing, their sides are exposed, they're completely vulnerable to devastating flanking maneuvers.
And military doctrine dictates you don't use your prime offensive armor to guard your own side door.
Exactly. You need a separate, dedicated force keeping pace on the periphery. The text notes that to manage this, the Lötzen Infantry Brigade was placed under the command umbrella of Group Brand, which was led by Otto Ernst Ottenbacher.
Ottenbacher, right.
Their sole strategic mandate on August 16 was to be that parallel shield for the Third Army.
Which brings us to the demographic reality of who was actually holding that shield. Because the source material reveals a detail that completely changes the complexion of this unit.
It really does change how you visualize them.
The brigade was formed in what the text calls the Landwehr mode.
The Landwehr classification is a fascinating element of German military formations. It fundamentally dictates the operational tempo the brigade is capable of maintaining.
Right, and the Wikipedia text defines Landwehr for us, right there in the article. These are reservists, aged 35 to 45.
Older guys.
Yeah, we're talking about an entire brigade manned by middle-aged men. These aren't fresh 18-year-old recruits who have been training for months in a barracks.
You're looking at men who have deep, established roots in civilian life. They have careers, families, and entrenched daily routines.
Imagine being, say, a 42-year-old baker or a clerk with a whole established life, and suddenly in mid-August you get tapped on the shoulder to go guard the flank of a massive invasion force.
Plucking that specific demographic out of the civilian workforce is a massive societal disruption. But from a strategic resource perspective, It's a highly calculated allocation of manpower.
It speaks to the resource strain command was already anticipating. They knew they couldn't afford to waste prime active duty stamina on a static guard detail.
Precisely. The vanguard of the Third Army needed the younger, highly conditioned troops to maintain the brutal operational tempo of the main thrust into Poland.
The tip of the spear needs the most energy.
Right. The Landwehr troops, however, possessed a different kind of asset maturity and prior military training. A 40-year-old reservist in 1939 likely has foundational military competency from earlier service.
That makes sense.
And flank protection is often a more static, defensive posture compared to the spearhead. It requires discipline and the ability to hold a line, but it doesn't necessarily require the peak physical endurance of a 20-year-old shock troop.
So they're conserving their premium offensive assets for the heaviest combat and utilizing the older, steadier hands to secure the perimeter.
Exactly.
But when you actually look at the specific unit breakdown in the text to see how these reservists were organized, you had a pretty glaring contradiction.
You do. The structural breakdown in the article definitely presents a historiographical puzzle.
In one paragraph, the text states very clearly, quote, "The brigade was made up of 2 Landwehr regiments, each consisting of 3 battalions and 1 Landwehr engineer battalion," end quote.
Right. 2 regiments and some engineers.
But literally the very next sentence claims, "The brigade included 3 infantry regiments and an artillery regiment." It's a complete structural mismatch sitting right there on the same page.
This raises an important question about how we consume historical records, especially synthesized sources like Wikipedia that try to capture the chaos of rapid military mobilization.
Because it's a synthesis of many different primary sources.
Exactly. When you're dealing with army formations spun up in a matter of weeks, the paperwork is rarely pristine.
Right. If you're a researcher trying to get a definitive count of how many men were on that flank, a contradiction like 2 regiments versus 3 regiments is incredibly frustrating.
And you also have an engineer battalion mentioned in one breath, but an artillery regiment mentioned in the next.
Yeah.
The reality of military administration in August 1939 was highly fluid. The plan structure on paper on August 16th, perhaps the initial blueprint calling for 2 regiments and some engineers, might have looked vastly different from the physical reality on the ground by September 1st.
Command might have suddenly realized they needed more density on that flank, diverted a 3rd regiment of Landwehr reservists off a train, attached an artillery unit they had in reserve, and updated the field orders.
And decades later, historians pull from different primary sources. One cites the initial mobilization order, another cites a post-action field report from September.
Oh, wow.
Both find their way into the Wikipedia article, and suddenly you have a structural contradiction that actually reflects the real-time adjustments of the Wehrmacht structure.
It's the fog of war bleeding right into the administrative record.
Exactly.
But despite that numerical discrepancy, the source articles provide a detailed breakdown of the structural components that made up this brigade.
And it's quite an extensive list.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because when we translate these German unit designations and look at them as a cohesive ecosystem, you realize just how robust this temporary unit was.
It wasn't just a makeshift auxiliary force. It was heavily layered and surprisingly self-sufficient.
Let's walk through the anatomy of the brigade. First, the text lists the Core Infantry Landwehr Infantry Regiment 161 and 162.
Okay, so these are the foot soldiers.
Right, the main body of our 35 to 45-year-old reservists holding the line.
They provide the crucial defensive density, the sheer manpower needed to physically occupy the space on the Third Army's flank and deter any opportunistic counterattacks.
But they weren't just relying on their rifles. The text also lists the Landwehr Artillery Regiment 161, so they had their own dedicated heavy artillery support organically attached to the brigade.
Having internal artillery is a massive tactical advantage. If an enemy force attempts a flanking maneuver, the infantry needs immediate suppressive fire.
They can't just wait around.
Exactly. If they had to radio the Third Army and wait for external artillery support to pivot and re-aim, the delay could be fatal. By having their own artillery regiment, the Lötzen Brigade could operate independently and respond to threats in real time.
They also had the Landwehr Pioneer Battalion 161, pioneer translating to combat engineers or sappers.
The combat engineers are the tactical problem solvers. They're the ones shaping the physical environment to suit the brigade's defensive needs.
Like what, specifically?
Whether that means destroying bridges to slow an enemy advance, clearing roadblocks, or laying down defensive minefields to harden that flank.
Wow. And to make sure those engineers and artillery units knew exactly where to focus their efforts, they had the Landwehraufklärungsschwadron 161, which is a dedicated reconnaissance squadron.
The sensory organs of the brigade. You can't effectively shield a moving army if you're blind to what's over the next ridge.
Makes total sense.
The recon squadron would operate ahead of and parallel to the main infantry line, probing the terrain, identifying enemy movements, and feeding that intelligence back to the artillery and infantry commanders.
To keep this entire ecosystem functioning, we see the Landwehrversorgungseinheiten 161. These are the supply and communications departments.
The logistical tail is often the most complex part of a mobile formation. Feeding thousands of men, transporting heavy artillery shells, maintaining medical supplies, keeping the radios powered.
It's a massive undertaking.
If the supply units fail, the combat effectiveness of the entire brigade degrades within days. The fact that they had their own dedicated supply units further proves they were designed to operate as a self-contained pocket army.
Rounding out the structure, the text mentions a Grunzwacht regiment, which translates to a border guard regiment.
Which perfectly aligns with their operational theater in eastern East Prussia. As the vanguard pushes forward, the immediate territorial boundaries still need to be secured to prevent infiltration behind the lines.
When you look at that complete structural list, infantry, artillery, combat engineers, recon, supply, and border guards, it's a breathtaking organizational feat.
It really is.
They drafted a comprehensive blueprint for a miniature, self-sustaining army, polled the specific middle-aged civilians required to fill those exact specialized roles, and deployed them to an active invasion flank in a matter of weeks.
And yet this deeply complex machine was only meant to exist for a single season.
Right. The rapid assembly is impressive, but the administrative ruthlessness of its disbandment is equally telling about how the military apparatus functioned.
It's almost jarring how quickly they pivot.
Let's look at that disbandment and the legacy of a unit. The source text tells us that in November 1939, the brigade was reformed in a town called Juko.
Juko served as the administrative hub in the region for this specific reshuffling.
And the men weren't just demobilized and sent back to their civilian jobs. The text states the brigade was merged into the 311th Infantry Division, which was under the command of General Paul Goldner.
So they were absorbed.
Exactly. The Lötzen Infantry Brigade, as an independent entity with its own name, commanders, and specific structural identity, just ceases to exist.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the disbandment aligns perfectly with the conclusion of the initial operational phase.
Right, because September was over.
The invasion of Poland in 1939, Case White, was effectively over by late autumn. The dynamic, highly fluid requirement for a mobile flank guard protecting a rapidly advancing Third Army was no longer the reality on the ground.
The front lines stabilized?
The territorial lines had shifted and the strategic requirements changed.
The bespoke tool had served its singular purpose.
Rather than keeping a redundant, undersized brigade hanging around with its own separate command staff and logistical overhead, the military bureaucracy simply dissolved the organizational boundaries.
And it just wiped the slate clean.
They took all that raw material, the Landwehr infantrymen, the engineers, the artillery crews, and absorbed them into a larger, more standardized formation. The 311th Infantry Division, under General Goldner, offered a centralized chain of command that was better suited for the next phase of the war.
So what does this all mean? Why spend our time exploring the 90-day existence of a single, highly specific brigade?
It's a fair question.
I think the overarching takeaway here is a profound lesson in organizational agility. When we read about massive historical conflicts, it's easy to visualize armies as these permanent, monolithic blocks of stone slowly grinding against each other.
The terminology we use often reinforces that static imagery. We think of divisions and armies as permanent fixtures.
But the microhistory of the Lötzen Infantry Brigade proves that massive operations actually rely on a deeply modular approach. The Wehrmacht structure functioned more like a massive set of Lego bricks.
That's a great analogy.
Command could snap together a bespoke brigade with exactly the right mix of artillery, recon, and Landwehr reservists to solve a highly specific 90-day logistical vulnerability on a flank.
And the moment that vulnerability was resolved, they immediately broke those bricks apart and snapped them onto a larger division.
Exactly. It's a level of ruthless, pragmatic adaptability that you don't fully appreciate until you zoom in on a unit like this.
It completely disrupts the narrative of static military history. You realize that beneath the grand strategic arrows drawn on the maps, there is a constant churning administrative engine assembling and disassembling tens of thousands of lives in real time to optimize resources.
And that leads to a fascinating human element that often gets buried under the unit designations and dates.
I think that's the most compelling thread to pull as we wrap up. We spent a lot of time analyzing the top-down perspective, the generals moving those modular Lego bricks around East Prussia, but consider the profound psychological whiplash experienced by the individual men inside those units.
Just normal guys.
Imagine the reservist assigned to the supply department, or the border guard regiment.
A guy who, in July, is a 42-year-old civilian, completely entrenched in his daily routine.
He is abruptly pulled from his home in August, handed a uniform, and thrust into the chaotic periphery of a historic military invasion in September. He has to quickly adapt to the terrifying reality of securing a flank, forge bonds with his unit, and learn how to function within the highly specific ecosystem of the Lötzen Brigade.
That's a massive adjustment.
And then, just as he potentially gets his bearings, November arrives. The entire structure he just acclimated to is dissolved, his direct commanders are replaced, and he is swallowed whole by the massive apparatus of the 311th Division.
The total erasure of the unit identity he just spent 3 months risking his life for.
It forces you to really consider what it means to be a tiny, temporary, completely expendable cog in the massive, rapidly shifting machine of history. The sheer lack of individual control when confronted with that level of organizational agility is staggering.
It really puts it into perspective.
It's a sobering reminder that every rapid administrative adjustment on a general's map translates to a profound disruption in the lives of the men on the ground.
That is an incredibly powerful perspective to end on. It injects a very visceral human reality into what could otherwise just be a dry list of dates and unit numbers.
History is always human at its core.
It reminds us that behind every Wikipedia contradiction and every deactivated brigade, there are thousands of individual stories caught in the gears of mobilization. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive today. We hope this exploration gave you a few aha moments and a new way of looking at the hidden, temporary margins of history. Keep your curiosity alive, keep questioning the footnotes, and we'll see you next time as we unpack another fascinating topic.